We've got Sumant Sinha of Renew Power joining us this morning. Mr. Sinha, good to have you with us again. Now, let's dive into this. That the power sector, while power surplus does depend significantly on outside imports, especially Chinese ones for thermal and solar power, plant capacity. How can we actually make the sector Atmanirbhar, so to speak? We just heard the Prime Minister talking about the immense potential there. How do you see things in the space?
Hi, thank you for having me on your show. Look, I think it's very simple. We have very significant and ambitious plans as a country to invest in solar power and renewables more broadly. And I think it makes sense because renewables now are the cheapest form of new energy and they're clean. And so therefore they're non-polluting and good for the environment and good for the climate. So I think expanding renewables as fast as possible, I think is a total no-brainer. And I think the government has recognized that several years ago and has been pushing the rollout of renewables as best as possible. And I must say, for all of us, we're actually very fortunate that the Prime Minister has been the biggest supporter of the sector. And he set a target now of 450,000 megawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And what that means is that we'll have to invest almost $300 to $400 billion on the generating side in solar power over the next 10 years. Now, if you think about it, the equipment of that will cost us about $200 billion. Now, either we can import that equipment more or less totally from China, because a lot of it does come from there, at least especially the modules, or we can over time try to develop a domestic manufacturing industry. And in the beginning, it might very well be that the cost of that domestic manufacturing industry is a little bit higher, and therefore the prices of solar go up a little bit. But it's not going to be very significant. And I think just given where the price of solar is, even a small increase will not be very significant. And so I think on that basis, we can start supporting the development of a solar module manufacturing industry in India. And I think over the next 10 to 15 years, that will be a very, very strong benefit for us to have as a country, where we will have basically indigenized the entire value chain. I think that is very critical. It's very important. And I think that's the direction that the government is moving in.
Okay. Morning, Mr. Sinha. Nikunj also joining in. Now, I'm not an expert in power sector, but whatever limited reading I've done, I understand that there are a lot of solar voltaic cells which account for a main part of the solar power in India are essentially imported from China, something which India cannot produce. So, at a time when we are saying that you make India Atmanirbhar, how does one really go about understanding the gap which will get created for something which is not produced in India or is not efficiently produced in India?
That's a terrific question. And the answer is very simple. See, it will take 2 years at least for any manufacturing capacity to be set up in India. And so for 2 years, and also all the solar projects that have already been bid out so far, all of those have assumed that we will be able to import modules cheaply from China. And the tariffs are therefore have been bid out assuming that. And so therefore what the government needs to do is actually something very simple, that for the next 2 years, all the bids that have already happened, those should continue to be allowed. They should be grandfathered in effect and allowed to import solar modules from China. At the same time, the government has to in fact say that, look, from X point of time onwards, there will be a customs duty that will be implemented, and any solar imports that happen for new bids will not be allowed, or they will be allowed only with a certain customs duty. That customs duty will then allow, and giving that visibility of customs duty to potential new manufacturers like us, will then give us the comfort of knowing that, okay, this is going to be the likely tariff for solar modules in India. And that is going to carry on for, let's say, the next 7 to 10 years. That will give us sufficient protection. And that will then allow people to start investing in solar module manufacturing in India. And 2 years later, not right now, but 2 years later, all those capacities would have been set up. And for all the bids that happen from, let's say, 6 months onwards, those can then start using domestic modules manufactured in India, assuming that the pricing is based on Indian manufactured products. So that's the way you have to do it. It's not a switch that you turn on and then from tomorrow we prevent all imports. You cannot do that in the sector. It's a continuously moving sector. You have to roll out this whole plan of action and give a 2-year transition period. But post that, we should have domestic modules that are then used. And keep in mind that renewables is not a 2 or 3 year story. This is like a 20, 30-year story. So if out of that, the first 2 years is a transition period, and then the balance 18 to 20 years are using domestic modules, and we develop that industry, I think that is really what we need to do.
The other challenge, what I understand, and especially from companies like yours who are in the business, is that look, the states are disregarding what they committed to, both in terms of buying the power and also in terms of committing to a fixed rate. What has been your experience? I mean, one side you've got discoms which are in a challenging situation, and right now, if an entrepreneur puts risk capital to work without the backing of assurance or without the backing of a firm agreement, which in some cases is also null and void, don't you think this sector will not be able to attract private sector capital?
No, again, you're absolutely right. There is no gainsaying the fact that one of the weak links in the power sector in India has been for many years and continues to be the weak finances of the distribution companies. Unfortunately, we have, power is a concurrent subject, and therefore distribution to end customers is in the hands of state governments. And just given the way our regulatory structure is set up,
yes.
And given how pricing of power happens, it does ensure that or keeps the discoms in poor financial health. And so I think the central government again is working on plans to address that problem. Everybody is aware of this being an issue, there's a new Electricity Act draft that is being proposed. Hopefully that gets passed. That will really strengthen the whole regulatory framework. And I think over a period of time, there will have to be a move towards privatizing distribution companies. The central government again has started that process with the announcement of the privatization of the union territory distribution companies. And certain states are also beginning to move in that direction. And I think when that happens, then over a longer period of time, let's say 5 to 10 years, you will have a situation where the distribution sector has been improved substantially. And then all of this in some ways, the problem that we have of the distribution side that gets passed to the rest of the value chain, and that then prohibits or inhibits investments in the back end of the value chain, in sectors like ours, for example, that will then stop. So I think longer term, everybody knows what the roadmap is. It's now a question of implementing it. The central government certainly seems to be moving in that direction. It would be great if the states also become partners in that journey and get to a point where the entire power sector can be really made much more healthy. And keep in mind the power sector in a sense is the base. Power costs are in every sector you have power costs. So the more we can get them down, the more efficient overall the Indian economy will become. So I think it's imperative on all of us to try to move in the direction of making the power sector more efficient and effective going forward.
There are government-backed entities like Coal India, NLC, NTPC. They're all foraying into renewable energy space. Do you think they have it in them to really be on a global competitive landscape and help India push the Atmanirbhar revival mission?
Look, I can't comment on other companies' capabilities and strengths. I wish them obviously all the luck to be successful in our sector. But if I just take a step back, as I said earlier, in the next 10 years itself, we need close to $500 billion worth of investments in our sector. No one company can do this on their own. We need multiple people investing in our sector, not just in the generation side, but also the back-end manufacturing side. And we need many more people, trained people to enter the sector, many more execution capacities to come in and meet this big target. Just to give you a very simple number, today we have 370,000 megawatts of total power generation capacity from all sources in our entire power sector. What we are trying to do in the next 10 years is only in renewables to add that same 370,000 megawatts. That's the scale of the challenge in front of us. And even if we do that, we will only get to a point where our per capita consumption as a country will only be half of the global average. So we'll still be way behind. And so really, this is an effort that is a national effort. It requires all companies, all people to really put their shoulder to the wheel and try to make sure that we're able to deliver against these targets. So I would welcome all companies to come into the sector and try their best.
Closing comments, Mr. Sinha. why is that we don't have a big success story in the entire power sector? The existing players, the big ones, companies which have been in existence for decades now, they are struggling. Wind energy companies, one of them, which was a large company, has gone bankrupt. We don't have any large success stories in the power sector. I'm keeping your firm aside. I know it's doing a great work, but in general, you'll appreciate the essence of my question is that here is a country which is power deficit. Here's a country where just about every corporate house at some point in time has invested or has burned their fingers in the power sector. But the bottom line here is that power sector has not created too many fantastic companies in India.
I agree with you. I think with the exception of a couple of government-owned companies like NTPC and Power Grid Corporation, which are, of course, government-owned and very large incumbent utilities at this point in time, I tend to agree with you. But if you look at it, the power sector in India, especially from the private sector power side, is literally only 15, 16 years old. The whole power sector was in the government hands, and you would recall maybe growing up that you had these SEB, state electricity boards, that did everything. Those were then split up only in 2003 when the Electricity Act was first passed by the NDA 1 government, and it's only after that the private sector has gone into the power sector space. And the first move really was in the generation side, where everybody got into coal. I think people were a little bit aggressive. They took very, strong calls on coal availability and so on, and just went ahead and set up projects without PPAs. Those decisions turned out to be difficult and perhaps wrong decisions in hindsight. At that point, maybe it might not have been that obvious. But what that has done now is that for companies that are now entering the sector, we now have a sense of what mistakes not to make. And therefore, we don't set up any capacities without PPAs. In the renewable energy sector, at least, there is no question of coal or any kind of fuel supply, so that problem is not there. Execution sizes for projects are smaller. They're 200-300 megawatts rather than 1,000 megawatts at a time. And so the hope is that now what you'll see is the growth of a more sustainable private sector set of companies, mostly driven out of the renewable energy space, because this is now the space that is growing. I think the coal sector, effectively, you will not see any more capacity addition happening in that sector. I think you're seeing some companies developing on the transmission side. And I think as the distribution side is privatized, you'll see a lot of companies setting up in that area. And over time, you will see some integrated companies as well that are in manufacturing, in generation, and perhaps in distribution as well. So I think you will see over the next 10 to 20 years, the evolution and development of a much stronger, robust private sector ecosystem in the power sector in India.